Welcome to the DevOps Days DC Resiliency Engineering panel on COVID-19. My name is Victoria Guido. I'm the Vice President of Operations at Pluribus Digital and organizer of this conference and of the local DevOps DC meetup. I have three panelists with me today. I'll give them a chance to introduce themselves. First is Dr. David Woods, one of the founders of Resilience Engineering. Do you want to say hi, David?
I want to thank you and for including us. I got started in taking resilience engineering into the critical digital services world and software engineering through John, who's on the panel. And what he showed me is that you are the perfect place both to succeed and to demonstrate what happens when we get into trouble in terms of following key findings and principles in resilience engineering. So you're a key hallmark for the future for everybody, as well as ways to improve what you've already done to build resilience so that the systems work as well as they do, despite the fact that your success leads to more growth, more relationships, which means that your success has to become a new success as the situation changes and grows in capability and scale.
Thank you. And we also have Laura McGuire, who's a researcher at Jelly. You want to say hi, Laura?
Hi there. Yes, I also got brought into this world through John. We were both attending Lund University in the master's program of human factors and system safety. And I started to see a lot of overlap between things that I was seeing in natural resource industries around risk, around adaptation, and around coping with complexity. And I did my doctoral research with Dave Woods, focusing on distributed incident response practices in DevOps teams that were responsible for critical digital services. I'm happy to be here today.
Well, thank you for joining. That's very exciting. And John Allspaw, John Allspaw, who is the founder and principal at Adaptive Capacity Labs and a major person in resilience engineering as well.
Yes, hi. My name is John. I'm the only panelist without a PhD. I would say, but when I do, everything's over. Yeah, my background is in software. I have a relatively annoying habit of addiction of asking questions, and that led me to Dave's work, and I am looking back now, some many years later, I'm pretty pleased with how we and others have been bringing these perspectives, some of which are pretty unintuitive, from resilience engineering into the software world. So yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Great. Well, I'm very excited. And my first question for you, for those who don't know, what is resilience engineering? If you can give me a brief summary of an entire field, and what might help as well is to add an example of resilience engineering in action during the pandemic. So since John, we ended with you, I'll start with you this round.
Oh, okay. I think the other panelists would be, it would be good for the other panelists to weigh in as well. Let's see. I'm going to punt a little bit on what is resilience engineering. The thing that comes to mind with regards to the pandemic is that conditions and investments, things that are set out beforehand, maybe even without a lot of justification for doing those things, is what made adaptation possible across on every scale, at every level, from supply chains and the huge amount, the myriad of medical, the monitoring, the tracking, the collecting, the analysis of data, the production of a vaccine, the role that digital services, online services played in keeping society actually running as well as it did, is it's an excellent example, many excellent examples of what resilience looks like in reality. That's my high level, abstract, generalized, incomplete answer.
Sounds great. Well, then I might try the person who wrote the book on resilience engineering next. David Woods, would you be able to give us a brief description of what is resilience engineering?
So the thing that's very simple is resilience is a verb, right? My colleague in Starting This, Eric Hollnagel, says this all the time. It's about how you do things, what you can do, and it's a very specific class of verbs. Right? It's not nouns, it's not a state, so be careful with that. It's about what you can do, and it's about what you can do in the future when conditions change, when surprise occurs, right? When what you thought was the way your system worked, what you thought were the challenges you had successfully designed it to handle, turns out to be incomplete, and the world throws surprises and challenges at you. New forms of stress, new forms of difficulty and overload. So the key definition, now resilience in 15 years ago was a very odd word that very few people used, and mostly when I started using it in 2000, I got strange looks. I know that's a word, but what is it and what does it mean? Today it is ultra hyper popular in contradictory ways. So the best thing to do is remember not what resilience stands for, but what adaptive capacity stands for. And that's your readiness, right, or potential to change how your system currently works, right? The models behind it, the plans, processes, behaviors, to continue to fit changing situations given new forms of anomaly and surprise. So the simple phrase is being poised to adapt. And this is the idea that you have to make investments now in order to be ready to respond to new challenges in the future, right? And you have to be ready to revise, right, your processes and models and understanding in order to do that. The challenge for us from the beginning was that most of the systems we have are competent. For example, we have good reliability statistics in our digital services, but brittle. So they fail or risk failing and collapsing at the edge of their envelope when new challenges arise. Now, the trick here is the biggest driver of surprise at the boundaries of your system, things that's going to reveal where things don't quite work the way you thought, is your past success. Because your past success leads to growth, and growth leads to new scales, new relationships. And so now we end up having these problems where issues arise that are small, right? So take the Fastly outage. We've got obviously the Facebook outage recently, which everybody kind of knew what trigger went on, but the surprise isn't the trigger. The surprise was what is a trigger that could be innocuous most of the time ended up setting off a bunch of drivers which started pushing overload to different places, saturating other parts of the system, leading in this case to loss of services because we didn't understand, and in fact we can't track all of the interdependencies. The Fastly outage is a great one. A small change in Sweden turns out affecting a third-tier software service that hobbles Amazon cloud services, which everyone thinks if I just put it in the cloud, if you're not involved in software engineering, automatically everything will be okay.
Great, thank you for that. That's a great explanation. And Laura, did you want to add on to that definition or any example you want to bring up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I wanted to tease out something that Dave hasn't quite hit on explicitly, but is a big part of sort of how I understand resilience engineering as well. And that is the understanding of normal work. is what, in order to design these systems and in order to design technologies to support adaptive capacity, we have to understand what that is and where it comes from. And as Dave mentioned, it comes from the people working within these systems, their ability to make sense of what's happening in real time, to be able to recruit and reorganize teams effectively, to be able to cope with failures. And it's so the reason why this is important for the audience to know around resilience engineering is that there's a lot of tactics and a lot of strategies that they can use internally within their own teams to be able to understand what it means to do work in complex systems. And we'll talk about those a little bit later.
Well, we could get Victoria maybe a little controversial right off the start here. Right, we can hone in, especially for the DC community. And one of our colleagues, your colleagues in all this, has asked the question: why do reliable systems fail? Right, I mentioned, and everybody knows, everybody has great availability statistics, and yet incidents threaten outages pretty regularly everywhere. And in fact, we have outages of valued services to our various customers and other organizations that depend on the service we provide. And what that highlights is a fundamental misunderstanding. And so I want to start right out by proposing, that the SRE name has missed something, right? Missed something very, very important. And so if we think of it as about who's building the systems, not the site, the systems, because it goes beyond what looks like the site quite a bit, right? But it says reliability, right? And let's change that SRE to S3RE. 3 R's? What are the 3 R's? Reliability, robustness, and resilience. And resilience in a very particular sense about adaptive capacity that's called extensibility. So resilience as extensibility is the third one. Those aren't the same. So all of a sudden we start seeing that the thing of we can have high availability, which means we have built a system that is competent given our past experience and investments. We try to make that competent system robust to different kinds of disturbances, but which ones when we make it robust, we have to know which kinds of disturbances occur. Generally ones we know about or ones that have happened already. But as complexity goes up, that's insufficient in two ways. One is you can't be completely robust because you can't know all of the different pathways by which challenge will arise. Complexity makes that impossible, no matter how good you are. Right? And that brings us into the third aspect of resilience as extensibility, that however you're working, you need to be able to extend or stretch at the boundaries when those challenges and surprises arise. Laura just pointed out, it takes special investments to build that resilience as extensibility. They're very practical. They can be implemented by many organizations. They're being aided by technology such as what's under development at Jelly. And this then feeds back and expands your robustness so that you can achieve all 3 R's. Right? The idea that we simply get reliability and therefore few problems should arise and we should always handle them smoothly is a folk model that simply isn't true. And the greater the success of our systems, right, and the greater the capabilities they can deliver, the more you have to pursue all 3 R's together. John, do you want to, you've been waiting for me to roll this out. I mean, we have a little video explaining it, but you also have challenged me a couple times that this gets in the way of some of the standards in the industry.
I dig. You've been working on this patch to submit for a very long time, and I patch accepted. This is I dig it. I dig it. The only thing I would say is that much like the evolution of DevOps or the spread of new topics, that associated with SRE or any other sort of industry-wide perspective shifts. That's what's happening right now. The fact that we are having this conversation and that tools like Jelly are emerging is evidence to me that that it looks like that this is not a revolution, not a wave, not a phase, not an era, but it's certainly a period of perspective shifting. And I think that's really important. The notion that what we've been calling, the industry has been calling resilience, really, if you poke at it, really it has the meaning of what Dave refers to when he says robustness. And I completely agree.
So, Victoria, your experience is often in government software, right? Laura and John's are more in the commercial enterprise and SaaS systems. We've been talking a little bit about the differences because we've been asked by a variety of government agencies to talk about, how does this DevOps stuff really work? How can we bring more of it into government contracting on software systems? And certainly we've observed there's a pretty big gulf between the government contracting in the defense world, where the original revolution of continuous deployment that John was one of the pioneers of runs into some struggles when we look at the constraints of government acquisition.
Absolutely. In some ways, the government has more of a focus on what you could call robustness or resiliency. There's often plans to actually test failovers, and continuing operations is a focus, but there are challenges, and I would say that the future is here, but it's not evenly distributed across many agencies. There are a lot of agencies who are very forward-leaning and who are in the cloud, doing agile, doing continuous integration, maybe not continuous deployment, and have made a significant progress into achieving some of those goals. Department of Defense, and certainly anything that's in a secured classified information network, presents challenges with delivering code without access to the internet, let's say. So there's certainly lots of different challenges and people trying to accomplish those. And you mentioned, David, that resiliency and robustness is about being able to recover in times of unexpected change or unexpected challenges that come into your system. And in the federal government, especially, I think COVID-19 brought some really unique challenges just in terms of really accepting remote work, really pushing the envelope on virtual environments. And I wanted to hear from each of you on what you think the themes that have come out of this COVID challenge has brought into the resilience engineering field. Anybody want to pop in?
Yeah, I'm waiting for them. Otherwise, I told you it was density. Yeah. So I'm trying to be quiet. You have to edit this out.
So a couple things come to mind. So you mentioned remote work, right? I think. Well, actually, let me back up a level, back up a sort of a step here. One of the core stances in resilience engineering involves trying to understand the resilience that is already present in the wild, right? And there's a paradox there in that if things, even if there are challenges, if they're handled really well, they don't tend to get much attention, right? And because that's just normal successful work. It must be because, and invent some sort of rationale. And quite often that rationale is not really grounded in reality, or at least not really supportable, or it's in a vague hand-wavy way. The messy details matter. There's the organizations that had never had people working from home or never had people working remotely, certainly had a harder time than people who who did have some experience and years under the belt doing it. Now, of course, I'll point out as an aside, there's working remote, having a remote friendly and sort of welcoming workplace. And then there's doing that in the pandemic, where all of your kids are at home and you or your spouse or your kids might be really sick. But having said all that, what enabled organizations to move to almost overnight, an entirely different way of working is gold. The opportunity is to understand how they were able to actually get it done in ways that are concrete, in ways that are grounded, in ways that what are the ways that they were able to adapt, and what made that adaptation straightforward, right? And so for the example that comes to mind, we know of a company whose core business, their service, is a SaaS service, and they provide electronic medical health records for hospitals, for clinical environments. And they hadn't been in a situation where they had remote engineers and they had to move to a world where they did have remote engineers. In addition to that, because of the nature of their business, let's just say that 2020 brought some particular challenges. That 2020 was very different for, let's say, telemedicine or all of the other things that needed to be put in place. It meant that they had to, in some ways, in some cases, postpone or entirely shelve what their existing roadmap was to and put some things, and accelerate projects that were aimed at things like telemedicine, things that they might not have been able to imagine working on until many years later. So the question is one of many: was that straightforward, or how difficult, and what were the difficulties in them being able to say, hey, remember that roadmap that we presented at the beginning of March? Yeah, so that's, and that we may have described to our investors, and we hired people for, yeah, that's kind of out the window now. What are the ramifications?
So in several of my
that sort of
interactions with leaders of organizations, one major software firm, others multinationals, what's interesting is they kind of all breathed a sigh of relief. We got through this. We're intact. In fact, maybe we did okay. Yes, it's a changed environment we have to think about, but there was almost a tangible sigh of relief in one of the panels I was on with these folks. And what was crystal clear is they don't understand what happened inside their own organization. Many of these attribute their ability to survive relatively intact, the stressors that emerged, to technology. And while technology in this case happened to be a critical asset because of the nature of the global shocks, right? I want to remind everyone that the next global shock, right? Remember Facebook took out WhatsApp, which turns out to be critical in many third world countries for all kinds of things, right? A small change in Sweden took out Fastly, which people didn't realize undergirded a variety of services. Luckily, were restored fairly quickly, right? All of the signs out there is the digital infrastructure that underpins everything could be the source of the next global challenge that organizations are dealing with. The fact that you were part of the assets for this one is purely incidental, frankly. Right? When we're in this kind of interconnected world, you could be sending the challenges everywhere instead of everyone using you to cope with these other challenges. Now, my point is, Laura, because what she's doing and what Jelly is doing with Nora Jones and others, is to say, how do you really learn from these experiences? How do you create the pathways and interactions and facilitate those so that you could come back, that these executives could come back and say, oh, these really were the sources of resilient performance. This is where my organization is actually very brittle. And these are the kinds of things I didn't know we had as resources to draw on, which, as John and Laura have already pointed out, usually turns out to be people who use assets, sometimes like technology, in new ways to handle surprising challenges. So maybe Laura can talk a little bit about how we facilitate this learning.
Yeah, I think it's a big yes and to everything that's been said so far. There's a couple of things that I would tease out as being things that we explicitly noticed in research that we did kind of over the last 18 months, and particularly right at the beginning when the surprise was fresh and new and the adaptations that were required were very acute. So Dave's kind of pointing to this like acute, like the adaptation that has to happen right immediately, and then this kind of sustained adaptability, this ability to sustain this over time. And so in terms of a statement of what we saw was that successful adaptation was largely a part of frontline engineers, frontline engagement, and short cycle feedback. So the companies had to draw on their internal resources in ways that was unexpected and unanticipated, had to share knowledge in different new forms. And any of these sort of like previously established but smaller scale initiatives that may have been underway to sort of move towards remote work or to move towards these more flexible forms of reconfiguring teams and of sharing resources across the organization, those had to happen. Those had to accelerate. They had to sort of lean into that kind of way of thinking about who do we have, what capacities do they have, how do we use that broadly across the organization to be able to sustain, given that things are constantly changing around us. So that kind of leads us to this conversation about like, what is sustained resilience? And Dave's pointed to the importance of learning, of creating these short cycles of feedback that an event happens, people make sense of it, or they make partial sense of it because they are sort of localized. They work on one part of the system. They may understand that they have interrelationships with other parts of the system. But how do we create these forums where we can bring multiple diverse perspectives from across the organization? Someone like customer support, who's able to talk about the experience of an outage with the engineers, as well as management who may be talking to regulators, to investors, to all sorts of different external stakeholders. So how do we create these feedback loops that allow these different perspectives and understandings of what are their goals and priorities? How do they shift across those goals and priorities in real time? And how do they let go of some of those to be able to just get the service back up and running to begin with? So there's the short cycle kind of forums to be able to create those interactions, as well as these longer cycles of reflection within an organization of who has knowledge, where does it reside within the organization? How quickly can we make that knowledge and skill sets and access to certain software components or physical data centers, as it were, to be able to react and respond in real time?
So Laura's helped us set up three key things for people to think about, right? And the first one is she mentions about tempo. How you've got to pick up the tempo and get when challenges arise. And this is where I said resilience is a verb, right? That you always have to think about you're on a vector, you're on some trajectory of how you're doing, how you're changing. What are you doing? What are you injecting? This is what John developed in continuous deployment. she talked about recently at a couple things and the history and what it means today. It's right how it's about your verbs and especially how this plays out over time. So what did we observe in some other sectors from colleagues of mine and our own connections, for example, obviously in healthcare, right? How variety of levels and roles that normally were outside of real-time clinical high-tempo operations all of a sudden became part of high-tempo operations. Otherwise, there wasn't PPE in order to help the clinical frontline staff, or they were making decisions that now had immediate clinical relevance. Organizations, everyone was trying to learn, right? What she started with is, right, the third of the trio, or the first of the trio, depending on which way you want to orient it, keeping pace, being able to up the tempo, being able to learn, being able to synchronize in the middle, right? That she also then talked about and was the subject of her own personal research, as well as applying it in the products at Jelly. And so what we observed for many organizations is their ability to up their tempo, or to bring roles in who had to now engage in a new tempo of operations from a fairly static, much more bureaucratic process, had struggled. They could up it a little bit. They could move from a walk to a shuffle, but to get to even to a jog was pretty tough. They could change direction a few degrees because it was forced on them. But they were just, the paths they worked through bureaucratically are so well worn and driven into the terrain that to climb out of those ruts for very long or to go very far was just too difficult. And so you can start to see how, without preparing the landscape and the resources, but the mechanisms, the dynamic, active mechanisms that allow you to be able to do things, right, at these levels of how do you keep pace? How do you anticipate what's coming at you in terms of shock or overload or saturation and bottlenecks that undermine resources in order to act early rather than react late, right? How do you integrate different roles? All of a sudden, a hospital director becomes part of clinical practice, or the way Laura just talked about it, because we have to share knowledge and experience over different parts of this growing tangled network of capabilities. And then we have to go back and continually update. We have to continually update because we cannot have a perfect model of how our system works. The complexity, the growth of capability leads to complexity, right? Which means no one can have a complete and accurate model. We can only get it by merging in dialogue the diverse perspectives and background of experiences. And of course, that plays out very dynamically in an actual incident response. So we see three basics that we've talked about for 20 years in resilience engineering, almost from the beginning, right? The positive is anticipation, right? Versus, right, we're slow in responding and we can't keep pace with the events and the challenges they present, right? We need to synchronize across new roles and levels of the organization. And do that at matching the tempo of operations in the first one. And then we have to be able to have mechanisms to revise and learn and change and update our models. So it takes what John and others started 12, 13 years ago in continuous deployment and kind of ratchets it up, and this continuous updating, continuous adaptability. Organizations have to be organized around being adaptive and changing. And many of the lessons outside the software world were that organizations that weren't organized around change struggled tremendously at great pain to match the challenges the pandemic threw at them.
I agree. And I think that some of the communication and that flow of learning and knowledge in the federal contracting world can even be sometimes set up specifically to silo and to prevent that kind of communication. I think that federal agencies have to be really careful with how they structure their teams and how they structure their acquisitions to enable that flexibility. I'm also interested in safeguards, one of our questions for today. Like, what kind of safeguards, because the government loves to put in those rules and regulations. So, we're going to do resilience engineering. So we're going to do supply chain risk management reduction and require SBOMs for all of our software, or zero trust security, those types of guardrails. So John, you're shaking your head. I'm going to start with you. You seem like you have an opinion on that.
Sorry, yeah. Guardrails, safeguards, all of these are fine. These are fine, but they don't come for free. And so, for example, you could say that we only want to have, we want developer desktop laptops to be physically connected to the corporate headquarters or the headquarters of an agency. And let's say if you're traveling, then you've got VPN and you can get this and that, but you can't do everything because you're on VPN. And, the evil hackers are out there and you don't want, that sort of thing. Excellent. That's a great, it's a safeguard. That's a liability when all of a sudden you have to work remote. So think of, there's a common trope in the community is that if you look far enough, you'll find that DNS is part of every outage, right? It's always DNS. I don't know how many times we've come into contact with an incident where there's something working. I mean, something's busted or something's some sort of anomalous, it should be network broadcast storm or some sort of a lower level issue, and DNS is collateral damage. All of a sudden, people who have, let's say, SSH sessions still open to servers, the things that the policy was that you should never have to do that, but they had them open. All of a sudden, you were violating a policy in the one hand, and then all of a sudden there's an incident, and thank God they were violating the policy because they're already on the server and they don't have to resolve names, right? So safeguards, again, the safeguards are like procedures. They absolutely make sense to the author of them. The author of them cannot anticipate and imagine scenarios where those procedures or policies or safeguards or those sorts of things might be used or called upon, or might absolutely need to break. There's a paradox, a dilemma there, and we need to at the very least acknowledge it.
So we've seen that the government approach often ends up fragmenting and bureaucratizing the process in a way that runs in the exact opposite direction of being fluid in change, having high adaptive capacity. It puts a variety of barriers so strong that my example of even when challenged, maybe you really can't change the tempo and direction effectively in the way you who and how you synchronize. Now, we see this in industry too, and we see this in places where, again, fragmentation. We start having new managers running new shops who then have responsibility for one piece, who have to work with the manager and shop of responsibility for another piece. And the more you stand up these, the more difficulties that are going to arise in synchronization, updating, keeping pace with events. You're going to make it more impossible to have high adaptive capacity and be effective in these situations. So it isn't simply a government commercial barrier. It's really more about moving away from a highly fragmented, organization chart oriented. And that's where the guardrails and things. We're being defensive all the time, which will inevitably slow everything down. This would not work well. Irony for DoD is this doesn't work at all in actual military operations. Everything there is the opposite. In fact, besides clinical work in emergency rooms and ICUs and emergency medicine, one of our best laboratories, right, before we got to critical digital services was the military, right, where we have 100 and almost 200 years of history about who can adapt more effectively, recognizing things aren't the way they expected and readjust, right, leads to success, versus the laggards who were stuck in stovepipes and silos, et cetera. So it's very ironic that when it comes to other kinds of operations, including new developments that are software intensive, they go in the exact opposite direction that's needed. So it really is a kind of paradigm shift. It requires a kind of reciprocity and trust, that you build together different units at different levels who are willing to work together. And there's certain commitments that get built up. And we've talked about these in some of the papers that circulate. The joint activity paper talks about this basic compact to align goals, to work to align goals. We talk about it in the work from the Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom, the first woman to get the Nobel Prize in economics till this year. Now there's two. But what did she highlight? That this notion of reciprocity that we can build on, that for these things to work, and the cases that John and Laura talked about, I have to be ready to stretch to help others that are at risk of brittle collapse, in the belief that they will help me if I'm the unit or the operation within the organization that's at the risk of being overloaded or saturated given the new challenge. So if we can build these kinds of connections, especially when things are tough or getting overloaded and are different. And so we're not always working the same way. One of John's points about continuous deployment, they're not all the same, right? And we build up this continuous adaptability in how we work together. Now, the good news, the bad news is this is a big change for some organizations. It's a real radical redesign of how they relate to each other and what's the key priority. The good news is we actually have some pretty good guides on how to do this from a science fundamentals point of view. That this isn't just, okay, we can do it the way we feel like, or this sort of fits with our identity as an organization. Sorry, that's nice, and you might be okay intuitively. Sometimes in this industry, you've been actually pretty intuitive, surprisingly, and good for me, because I go, oh, wow, you guys had great insight. But we put it together and say there's a real science behind this about why some things work and other things are never really going to work. And that has now matured to the point that we're ready to put that into more practice if organizations are willing to join hands and invest and trial some new directions, which in many ways is like the way continuous development and deployment took over. Continuous integration took over on the commercial side in a relatively rapid fluorescence, as we would say in adaptive capacity speak. It was a rapid fluorescence, and we are in great need of some of the investments and initial seeds to stimulate a new fluorescence so we can move from things that end up being too bureaucratic and guardrail centered. Not that you shouldn't have guardrails, but they become centered around it, which means you will be defensive and slow when you can be sure that new challenges will arise that fall outside the capabilities that you knew about and planned for and stuff. You will need to modify how you're robust, and you will always need to facilitate and grow the sources that give you resilient performance when inevitably the next shock occurs.
I think I'll just do a final round, final thoughts you want to share with the group to get some extra time, or
after my rant?
Yeah. Ranting is allowed.
I have some experience speaking Davish, and I think the translation would be play stupid games, win stupid prizes. I have nothing else to add. I think my hope, and here's what I would say to the folks attending DevOps Days. My hope is that this panel and other talks on these topics and other panels at other conferences generate discussion. That's how that's how we do, and that's how progress will be made to keep these topics alive.
Great, thank you. Laura, do you want to add anything to that?
My fellow panelists are infinitely eloquent. I don't think I could top that, other than to reaffirm John's sentiment there that, you know, the work that you all who are listening today is doing is fundamentally changing and influencing society in ways that we are not even entirely sure of at this point in time. And so your voice matters, your experience matters, and you know, your ability to sort of advocate for the capacities to adapt and adjust in real time is important. And we hope that that's what a lot of resilience engineering is doing, is giving you tools to be able to, and language to be able to continue that work within your company.
You know, the continuing shocks, not just the pandemic, but the current supply chain disruptions. You know, a variety of things have happened and grown that illustrate a variety of brittle points globally throughout society. And that raises a big question we've been debating in a variety of circles around the world, and that is, do we retreat and go back? Can we go back to the comfort of the way we used to do things? Or do we reconfigure and in a quest to renew what's important, re-examining what the key priorities and relationships are, so that we renew our ability to pursue what are the key goals for our organization embedded in an interconnected human world that pursues and influences and aspires to a variety of successes for people, for real people. And we need to recognize that you can't go back. Right? We've changed. You know, think of anthropomorphic genesis of extreme climate events. Right? The world has changed in ways, and we need to rethink various forms of infrastructure in order to deal with extreme weather events. We have to reconfigure moving forward, and that requires a renewal, new relationships, new moments of reflection about what's really most important, and new ways of working together. And that's the opportunity now. The temptation is to pause and to go back to an image of what the world was like before, and try to retreat back into those old ways, which will actually narrow our ability to do things and narrow our ability to adapt moving forward. So renew or retreat, there's a great opportunity to renew and reconfigure how we do things.
I agree. And I think that it's incredibly critical to federal government and state governments who are providing that critical infrastructure for people who need to access services when there's power outage or emergencies. We were dealing with citizenships and all types of really important information, and it needs to come into the mindset from everyone, from acquisitions all the way down to contractors and people who are doing on the ground work. So I really appreciate you all coming here today and providing your insights and being such a wonderful panel, making it easy for me.
My name is Jim Weir. I've been with Accela about 4.5 years. It is at Accela that I have pivoted into the field of DevOps and started to build my expertise in that area as well. Maybe one of my favorite aspects of what I do is to help other developers become unblocked in their work. That's often more rewarding than anything I would do for my own work. Accela works with our government clients every day to push the envelope of DevOps and cloud architecture engineering. We are using the latest AWS technologies to build out some cutting-edge cloud-native solutions for our clients. I would love to talk to you more about that in our virtual booth.
The promise of the cloud is speed and agility. But as enterprises move to the cloud, networking architects and engineers find it isn't the nirvana they expected. They uncover security challenges, networking limitations, lack of network visibility, and manual processes. That's why we created Aviatrix, a cloud network platform that combines the simplicity and agility of the cloud with advanced networking and security capabilities enterprises require. Today, over 550 enterprise customers use Aviatrix software for their cloud network. Whether just running in AWS or multi-cloud environments that include Azure, Google, Oracle, and Alibaba clouds. Is your network ready for multi-cloud? But seeing is believing. To get started, simply find us on any cloud marketplace or speak to one of our Aviatrix solution architects.
Hi, DevOps Days, Washington, D.C. We're happy to be here with you for this great event. Chef has been helping to drive the DevOps revolution for more than 10 years now, and if you haven't tried Chef lately, you'll be amazed by some of our latest innovations. With the introduction of Chef Workstation, we've made infrastructure automation and system compliance easier than ever. We've added new resources and tooling that make the Chef experience for developers lighter, simpler, and more powerful. So if you're still using Chef Workstation's predecessor, Chef DK, now's the time to upgrade to take advantage of these great workflows. More recently, we've embedded inspect compliance profiles into cookbooks that, together with policy files, make the whole Chef compliance phase straightforward. Over the past year, we've continued to enhance Chef Automate Dashboard, our go-to tool for managing your system at a glance. Chef is innovating rapidly, and we're proud to be part of the DevOps journey.
Hello, I'm Camille Clayton, and thanks for coming to today's talk about SRE, Site Reliability Engineering. We'll be diving into how my team is using as a backbone for our operational practices, discussing one of our major technical outputs, and how Virtual Fire can bring inspiration to a team. Throughout this, I have a deep love for system design, distributed and serverless systems as a specialty, and we're jumping into how we built a new serverless system and the team that made it possible. Before we jump in, here's a little bit about me. I am an operations-focused team lead with 8 years of IT experience, and about half that time has been on government supporting work. I live in the DC area, have been working for Pluribus Digital for about 18 months, and have been involved with Women Who Code DC since 2018, and I started there as a director in late 2020. There, I give a monthly talk about DevOps-focused concepts, and I'll share a link to our next meetup in the chat, where we'll be diving into Elasticsearch. Also, this is my second DevOps ACC, where I've had the pleasure of giving a talk, and I'm thankful you all have tuned in today. With that, I'll be answering questions below in the chat. If you have any, feel free to add them to the discussion. So to set the stage, before we dive into those technical details, I want to paint the picture of what we were dealing with back in late April of 2020. So during that time period, I joined Pluribus Digital as they came into a contract supporting a client that was heavily affected by COVID-19. The switch to remote was hard as we had an offboarding contract team who had been fully co-located, and we were onboarding our teams fully remote. In short, chaotic was an understatement. Hitting the ground on this contract, our systems, even though lightly in use for mission critical, uptime was super important and they were suffering. These systems were at the tail end of a hybrid to fully cloud migration, and lots of work was in flight and incomplete. As team members from the prior contract offboarded, their knowledge was being lost by the day and everyone was getting anxious. To top it all off, alert fatigue was high. The system had a lot of alerts configured, but they were highly distributed amongst teams. There were numerous duplicate alerts, and there was no central game plan for how to deal with an alert when they came. And so as the situation got rougher, as we got further in, as we got into the early summer and COVID restrictions eased up, the systems began failing under the lightest of user workloads. It felt like they may have been built with hay and a stiff wind could blow them over. These system failures then led to days-long conference calls between internal and external teams, frustrated stakeholders, engineers, and there was a never-ending sense of panic as you waited for the next undocumented and fragile system to pop an error. And so as we sat and we talked and we had issues and discussions, we started thinking about how we could get through this situation. As part of a government contract, you have intentions and keys and guidelines. And one of our main keys was that we were focusing on DevSecOps as a key developmental practice. This concept involves shifting left, where you integrate security as a key and automated practice throughout your development lifecycle. Though, as we're getting into the middle summer of 2020, one of our deficits was we only had one security officer. And as we had been onboarded initially, we're struggling as a project to manage, security patching for our classical VM-based systems. The previous team had been much larger, about twice as large as we'd eventually get, and they had performed this work fully manually. They just weekly, monthly, year after year logged into every single system. We're talking at that point of hundreds of systems, and got the work done. But we've been on this contract now a few months, and we're about 40 persons strong on that team. That's going to grow to around 85 team members. We just couldn't sustain that. And so as someone with an operational background, having made some early wins from resolving system issues, I was then picked to be a team lead for a small operations team. This role would include being the central technical point for security implementation and analysis. The contract leadership would end up assigning me 4 engineers, and they gave me about a sprint's lead time to think about how to best utilize and implement this team. I took this to heart and sat down and chatted with each of the other engineers during that 10 or so days, and I produced 2 key documents. And the first document would be an output for how our team would be built, what our overall skills were, and what our goals were for the near and long term. Important among these, was discussing the fact that we had general experience as backend engineers, and we had deep knowledge in areas such as SQL reporting and database management, automation platforms in Jenkins and Ansible, and operating system support. Tend to highlight a few. And with this intention setting, we also set foundations for our culture as a team by encouraging important things to be written down, defaulting to open conversation and decision-making, and striving to cross-train as we grew as a team. And then that second document I created broke out what each engineer, including myself, had skills on, sort of a roster, a way to look at it, like if you're looking at like a fancy football team or a Pokemon team, depending on what kind of engineering nerd you are. But this roster would be really important when there was emergency. We could quickly figure out who had and who didn't have experiences with the system. As one of my takeaways from the troubleshooting bridges was we often didn't have the right person on the call for long periods of time, which is prolonged outages. There were some times where I could end up resolving a situation in 10 minutes, but it took 4 or 5 hours for someone to be like, let's try Camille. And we had issues with a number of different areas, as we had a very wide and sort of shallow project at that point. And the other main thing that came during the formation period of this operations team was after we've been working together for a few sprints, I had everyone take an hour and a half, and we each took turns discussing which things flustered us the most. And we took that list and we started, narrowing it down throughout that time, and we thought about which ones could be resolved. And so we took notes on that, and I worked with our Scrum Master who joined in the interim, and we developed a backlog of items to resolve. And this list we would eventually turn into Jira stories and epics. And so for an ops team, if you work with most ops teams, they generally don't work in traditional sprints development cycles. I've previously done Scrum, but we were doing more akin to Kanban initially, and then later we were working in a safe agile method along with program increments. For an ops team that was working side by side with developers, creating the backlog let us show visibly both the work we cared about and the work we were actively accomplishing. Even if it wasn't something a stakeholder could easily visualize or something we could easily demo, this ended up being a huge trust builder for our team and for the client. We've continued this method of backlog building every quarter since. And so I've talked a good bit about the team, but how does SRE come into play for this? So we had 9 development teams that we were supporting, and each has had unique and overlapping issues. And by the time we hit September 2020, my team had grown to include 2 additional engineers and a business-focused Scrum Master as a co-lead. This gave us enough room to tackle a combination of big and small issues. And those smaller issues are where our implementation of our SRE model was very impactful. If you haven't encountered SRE in the wild, it's a method for DevOps at scale that was popularized by Google. They have a series of free books and documents at sre.google.com, and their first book, Site Reliability Engineering, hit home to me in the mid-2010s when I was working as a sysadmin. Google's idea of an engineer in this model is one who's good at automating, problem solving, possibly a bit lazy, and one who might get bored. Where this type of engineer succeeds is at the team and the problem level. So if you have a team of these engineers, they aren't necessarily dedicated to a specific development team. They're not necessarily dedicated to the SRE team, but where they come in are effective as engineers is a slack to a team that's both stretched with their day-to-day responsibilities and is facing active production issues. So Google Site Reliability Engineer will rotate through various dev teams between every 1 to 3 months, which is enough time to sit with the team daily, gain understanding of their environment and the problems they're encountering, and to develop ideas and solutions that they and the team can implement to build a more robust and stable application. The end goal being that when the SRE rotates out, that the application is running better than before they arrived, and the team then is no longer running over capacity. So to kick off this team, this practice, the engineers that made up our team had come from being part of active development and development support backgrounds. And we focused out then on delegating each team member initially to dev teams at about 60% of the time, and 40% of their time, they'd be focused on project-wide operational tasks. Initially, our big project-wide task was on automation of security and feature patching, which involved configuration of Ansible Tower for our environment and working to train and test and then to automate this for multiple platforms as we have various flavors of Linux and Windows Server to support. After that, we were internally, we felt we were succeeding at this tagging off model, and the engineers were familiarizing themselves with the various dev stacks, but we were struggling daily with alerting. The issue was that alerts came from emails, but if no one was sitting at their desk, or if it came after hours, if the team was just really busy that day, they'd get missed. And we had dealt with the initial just flood in the summer and really cut down and stripped back the amount of alerts, centralize them. Dev teams could still get specific app alerts. We made sure the operations team was on every alert. We'd really cleaned up the stack, but we were still failing to catch alerts. And so I sat down one weekend and I came up with an idea. I had used a paging system before called Opsgenie. But I also knew with COVID restrictions that our budget was very tight on this contract. So with that in mind, a budget of effectively $0, what did I have access to? What could I build with? What could I think about? And so, everyone who's working in cloud has probably created a free account with AWS or one with Google or Azure. You probably have some sort of cloud account to test on. And our client had an AWS account. And so if I could build something in my own, little private one, and what I was willing to put on, a credit card, which was not very much, I could take that and move it forward. And so that was sort of what I thought about that weekend. What is the simplest version of an on-call system? And to me, the simplest version is just one where a user can call a single number, save that number in their phone, call it when there's an emergency, and it goes directly to someone's phone, someone's hand. And whether this phone is passed in a traditional system or if it's going to get virtually forwarded, as in our case, it doesn't really matter to the user. And even if outside of COVID, this team was designed to be a remote first and focused team. My operation team was spread across the entire East Coast, and the contract as a whole, we have engineers from as far north as Maine to as far west and south as San Diego. And so thinking about tooling that would work remote was really crucial to long-term success for this. Now, where the system of one phone number to one recipient is weak is what happens when that person doesn't pick up the phone. They don't answer a call. And so thinking back to that Google SRE workbook, it's a series of essays and more than one talk about this and how to design effective escalation and sustainable on-call rotations. And key to that is having on-call backups and really driving in mind blameless postmortems. We've all left our phone in the car. We've all, forgotten to turn do not disturb off. These things are common. And so you just make a system where it doesn't matter that much, and it makes it healthier mentally dealing with stressful situations. And so I went back to my personal AWS account and I started playing around with a tool that I knew existed called Amazon Connect. And by the end of a Saturday, I'd implemented the first version that would let a user know they were reaching out to an engineer. If that person didn't pick up, it would route to a secondary contact. And I got it working with 2 phones at my house. And then, I sat down the following day and I iterated, and reading the documentation, I realized I could create a Lambda function that could be invoked by Connect, but it needed data. And I knew about DynamoDB. I used it a little bit in training for one of my certs. And so I launched a DynamoDB to create a really simple schema that just had a phone number and a name, and pop, the phones I had at my house in there, and got the Lambda function working where as the workflow goes through, instead of having a hard-coded value, it now has a function that gets invoked when a user calls that number, grabs that data and has it ready, and Connect is able to have a fairly simple variable system that slides into. You can see how this works from left to right in my V1 design diagram here. You can see the user calls into that number is going to stay permanent, and there's a little bit of workflow, and then it gets to a phone. And this all happens fairly quickly. It takes maybe about 10 seconds overall to get the user to call. Amazon Connect, picks up on the first ring. They're going to get that immediate IVR voice response from the Amazon Alexa system. And then while Alexa is talking, it's getting the data calls processing, and it's figuring out who to call. If no one picks up, if the first 2 engineers in this system, in this basic system, don't pick up, Alexa is actually going to take a voicemail, render the speech into text, and create a transcript, and they'll email that transcript out. So even if that second person doesn't get it, it's going to go to a distribution list. It'll hit all 9 of the engineers on our team, as well as some of the managers on the contract. And so there's just a better chance, a wider chance of the alert getting out to anyone on our team with this version. And so after that first weekend, I started discussing this design with my colleagues at Pluribus Digital. I ended up talking a good bit with our CTO, now CDO, Ben Morris, and we ran through ideas of how to pitch this to the client, estimate costs, and what were future insights. As I come in with a real DIY mindset, the pricing on this was pretty low. I estimated even at a fairly high volume of calls, say we were getting 4 pages a week, it would cost about $15 a month to run. And so having these discussions, and not just having them with my internal team, but also feeling confident and being able to communicate back to sort of our central headquarters, it really helped me know I could create solutions, have ideas, and know this would all work in this remote fashion. This was my first job where I was fully remote. I had previously done working 2 or 3 days a week from home, but it was definitely a leap to go fully remote, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And so rolling forward, we had a few more weeks of tweaking. We developed a small presentation with my colleague, Victoria Guido. You may have heard her spoke. She was the host of the previous panel earlier today, and we gave it a first run then with our internal contract, technical leadership. And they liked it, but there was a strong worry that this would be a distraction. And so I took that feedback and we thought a bit, and we had some one-on-ones with some of the leadership, and we devised a plan to build out a version. If we could get client approval, and if we could implement it as a low priority work in sprints. So if we had anything in our sprint board, it came first. And that was something I felt we could reconcile. And I'll talk a bit about that more as we go through. And so as we got further in, we started working with the client. We had preliminary approval. That first pitch went really well, as it seemed from both a cost and time level that it was going to be a win. After discussion further up the chain, there were concerns from a security and data logging, communication tracking. What would happen on a phone call couldn't necessarily be monitored. And so we went back to the drawing board. And so we worked closely with our client to engineer a solution. And we came up with SMS, text messaging, as a safe medium, as we'd be able to log 100% of our communications. And as we have a large body of successful alerting, we just needed to get it to agents. Instead of thinking about it as a system where users could call, this is now just a system where alerting will actually reach the engineers who are on call. And so working backwards, we dove into what we had. We looked at the version 1, we tried to figure out what was usable and what wasn't from the solution. The first thing out was Amazon Connect, and in its place came Pinpoint. Pinpoint's a really cool service. It sits somewhere between Connect and simple notification service. It allows for a dedicated phone number, so engineers can save that number and they can set it to bypass Do Not Disturb. And what it does is it allows for handling of responses from engineers in a way that Connect couldn't. This system will allow you to acknowledge or to escalate. It has a few other little functionalities that are built in. If you tell it stop, it'll never text you again. Those kind of things are there for legal compliance. But it's been really easy to build and iterate ideas on. And keeping in this, working towards a high state of effort to result, we kept DynamoDB, but we expanded on its functionality, and we developed a schema that allows it to track event state for messages delivered through another tool that we added, API Gateway. And so I'll pull this up here. We set up API Gateway and we tested it with multiple tools, including New Relic, Splunk, and CloudWatch that's coming from the far left. And we were also able to send out custom messages using API Gateway and webhooks to Microsoft Teams, which allowed us to validate our changes. We were having it sort of be almost as an echo tool. Every time an alert comes in, it also goes to another channel, so we can validate that if we get a text that exists in the Teams, and if somebody's on a computer, they'll see the message as well. And we also put this in a place where the client could easily see, so they could see these iterations and they could see if there's an active alert. And so after about a quarter of a year of work, we provided a proof of concept demo, and we gained approval to hook it into production. And so with that, a few days after we went live, it was a couple of weeks after we got the approval, we tested a bit more in state before we went into production. But after we went live, we got our first system alert. An engineer was able to handle it quickly without bringing up a conference bridge. They, got it handled in 10 minutes on a Saturday, and I had seen it, poking around on a Sunday doing something. But we didn't have a conversation about it till Monday. It felt very good. The team felt empowered, and they knew the tool worked. And so that's really the joy in it. It's working with this team and out of this development process. Our operations team bonded. We learned to work in a remote and asynchronous fashion. We find ways to meet up at regular intervals for joint working sessions. This is how we wrote and got through roadblocks really consistently, where we would meet once or twice a month for 2 hours, either in pair programming or group discussions. And one thing we found as a team was, we had GitHub at this role, but GitHub was unknown to some of the team. And we really worked to fine tune that process as the code base grew. My initial proof of concept had a few hundred lines of code, and the current version has probably a couple thousand, if not, leaning towards 5,000 at this point. We've consistently then booked time to write documentation. And this is the most important thing that's really, come out of this process. As some sprints just, weren't able to allocate any time to making major progress. But having those up-to-date documentation allows us to keep track of completed versus outstanding work. And, it lets us know what's lacking. If there's a section where it's like to do, you can easily come and be like, aha, this is where we're going. And we really shared in the design process together. On top of that, one of those key things that came out was dog fooding. So as our team was developing this app, we became the first to use it. This led to a lot of realizations, insights, and quickly finding bugs. We used it during that 3-4 months for that proof of concept demo. We had it on non-prod, and so we were alerting on non-prod events. And so you could see, hey, this message is not formatted, or oh, it doesn't like, if it has, say, like a percentage sign, some sort of key setting. But it also came to better ideas to handle things like escalation. We've had a number of iterations on our escalation tab. But if we weren't using it, if we were just building it and then waiting for approval, we wouldn't have seen these things. And so I'd highly recommend, if you can find a way as a development team to use an app internally, even if you have to develop an extra feature pathway, this is going to enable your teams to see defects sooner and build more robust versions faster. Your team will want to use good software. And so by forcing them to use a bit of bad software, they're much more likely to build better software. And so thinking about good software, our team is currently working on the next iteration of the app. The goal in mind is that it can support on-call rotations for other developers and development teams in our programs. With 9 teams, we've had to really expand how our escalation of the app works, and we're rethinking our data model and schemas. And we're really excited to get the app into some of the development team's hands by the end of the year, if not early winter by the latest. And so thinking about like the larger outcomes, our operations team is much happier. Since we've gotten the CAP on-call system in production, we've had 3 systems outages, and all have been responded by an engineer and were able to be remediated. At the worst point, when we were talking about the middle of last summer, we were having 4 outages a week for unfortunately more than a few weeks. The developers are also happier. They've seen a decrease in false alerts, an increase in system stability, and they have to investigate less on triage and remediation. If a system crashes and you go through a post-mortem process and it's a bug in the system, and we had quite a bit of them, the developers end up with a lot more work, and that work tends to be lower value but higher priority. And anything you were working on needs to get stopped. It was really leaving people with headaches at the end of the week. On top of that, ultimately our stakeholders, and especially our client, is happier. They're trusting the system is going to be up, and in emergency, they know our operations team, our developers are going to be on top of the situation. And so ultimately in practice, this has helped us to have goodwill for additional ideas, and the client trusts us to help guide them to the best solution. And so with this bit of function, our team, those split between a variety of needs and skills, really came together. And we've built out not just a working system, but a needed one. We've pushed forward each month, we've learned, and we've understood how to design an application as a team. We've gotten used to accepting and taking feedback from clients and teammates. And we've learned how to work towards realistic milestones. And this progress has really impacted me. This is the first application I've led where I've had a team under me. I've built some things solo, but it's really amazing how far you're able to go when you have a team. Much further than I've ever been able to take an application, a tool, alone in the same amount of time. I hope each one of you, as you take on with your day, as you take on with your life, you look around at your workplace and you find ways to improve it. If not solely for yourself, in that selfish way of wanting to have good things, but also for providing for your teammates. And so, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Hope you enjoy lunch. Thanks again for coming to this talk. I wish each of you a great, rest of your DevOps Days 2021. And thanks for stopping by.
Pretty amazing start to DevOps Days DC 2021, don't you think?
Yeah.
All right, we're about to head to another break, but I want to share some things to know before you go. We'll be back here for more talks starting at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Between now and then, visit our sponsors in the expo area. You're the reason they're here. They want to hear your thoughts and questions, goals and challenges, because they want to help us in our DevOps journey.
And don't forget about those amazing prizes that you can win in the Sponsor Passport game.
Indeed. And with that, just remember, be back here for more talks starting at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Okay, that's it. Fuel up, recharge, check all the things, and we'll see you back here shortly.